right, so in this first segment, we're going to be taking a good, hard UBC look at maybe the most popular of all the Hindu gods. This is Lord Vishnu, the preserver and all pervader, the husband of the beautiful goddess Lakshmi, the protector of Dharma in our world. He's quite a familiar sight, of course, in mainstream Hinduism today, so you can actually go and see him whenever you want to in India if you just go to like a temple. But here's what I'd like for us to maybe try to do in our tour of ancient India. First, let's try to imagine what Vishnu would have looked like to people living in India almost 2,000 years ago, during that early period from about 200 BC to 500 CE. Then, just like we did with Shiva, let's maybe also try to see how Vishnu is imagined and worshipped in both his aniconic and iconic forms. Then, after a kind of a little digression into the concept of Hindu cosmic time, what I'd like to do is to take a look at how Vishnu is thought to have descended into our world over and over again whenever it needs to be rescued from plunging into the depths of chaos and disorder, adharma. So let's get going. So, what was Vishnu like back then in early India? The word Vishnu in Sanskrit means the one who pervades or enters things. The idea is that he pervades the cosmos, and is perhaps reflected even in that old Vedic myth, if you remember, that we looked at, where Vishnu's 3 steps covered the earth, the sky, the heavens. Just like Shiva, Vishnu is also known by a ton of other names: Hari, Narayana, Vasudeva, Bhagavan, Janardana, Keshava. The list goes on and on. In fact, many devout Vaishnavas even today, devotees of Vishnu, learn to recite the 1,000 names of Vishnu, the Vishnu Sahasranama. In the early period, Vishnu is kind of embodied or theologically made intelligible. He's an intelligible version of that formless, infinite Brahman of the Vedas and Upanishads. The idea is that if supposedly there's this absolute, transcendent, inaccessible force called Brahman, something we're supposed to eventually merge into in order to be freed from karma and rebirth, then Vishnu acts as a kind of worldly manifestation or representation of that force, of that Brahman. He's kind of an accessible icon of that inaccessible Brahman. Because he exists in the world, Vishnu then also takes a unique role of being a preserver of that world, a protector of that world. It's he who engages with the forces of chaos or darkness whenever dharma, whenever moral order is threatened. You can pray to Vishnu to help you in your hour of need, to right a wrong, to help you survive in this dangerous and treacherous world. But as was the case with Shiva, you have to be a true devotee. You have to worship him regularly at temples and at home, genuinely. Also, like Shiva, Vishnu can help his devotees escape the cycles of karma and rebirth. So he has both functions. This can be done through a bunch of different paths: knowledge and wisdom, yoga, or as we're going to find out in the Gita, a certain kind of inner faith and devotion to the Lord, bhakti. Here's a couple of interesting tidbits about Vishnu in early India. Sometime around 300 CE, the figure of Vishnu absorbed kind of 3 different distinct regional or folk deities who came to be considered as distinct emanations, and the Sanskrit word is vyuhas, of the one true God, Vishnu. Maybe the most philosophical, maybe, or abstract of these emanations is called Narayana. He's a deity who's worshipped maybe originally worshipped maybe in the northwest India, Pakistan, who's identified also as that primordial Purusha, you might remember. Remember, that was the primal man who was cut apart and sacrificed to create the entire universe. Narayana is typically depicted in iconography as being fast asleep in the ocean of milk, the Kshira Sagara, as it's called, on a massive 7-headed cosmic snake called the Shesha, while his wife Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, is loyally sitting by his side. There's also a tiny little baby version of the god Brahma, the grandfather of the gods, who's born out of a lotus that's growing out of Vishnu's navel. Often his loyal servants Garuda, the eagle, and Hanuman, the monkey, are also shown in the iconography. Vishnu's second emanation, his vyuha number 2, is the very popular Krishna Vasudeva, who's the deified hero and prince of the Vrishni tribe, who are located in the central northern area of Mathura, what's modern-day Uttar Pradesh. Krishna Vasudeva has a second persona as a pastoral god. In that persona, he's a cowherd who flirts with the cowgirls, who plays his flute, he dances and sings in the countryside. Both of these personas get kind of fused together in the mythological persona of Krishna. And one idea is maybe they were also originally different local deities, one from the Mathura region, and the other that's found in the Dwaraka region on the coast of Gujarat. The jury's kind of still out on all of this geographical analysis, but who knows? Finally, a third emanation or vyuha of Vishnu is called Balarama. This is actually Krishna's older brother, who's also known as Samkarshana, the plowman. Now you're probably wondering, how can Vishnu be both Krishna and his brother at the same time, right? That's part of the idea of this merger thesis. The idea would be that first, Balarama had been an independent folk deity who was being worshipped by farmers in and around North and West India in the early first millennium, and eventually the tradition gets brought into alignment, maybe with the other popular myths about Krishna, making them brothers, and then considering them both as being partial incarnations of the one Vishnu in our world. We'll get more into this idea of incarnations, descents, avatars of Vishnu in the second segment. But before we get there, let's ask how Vishnu is worshipped back then in early India. A lot of this is familiar to us maybe even today if you've ever been to a temple. There seem to be two major traditions of Vishnu worship in the early period. One is called the Bhagavata tradition, and the other is called the Pancharatras school. The Bhagavata tradition was more mainstream. And it developed around the beginning of the Common Era, we think, and it looked a lot like mainstream bhakti works today. And that we saw with Shiva in our last unit. The idea is to develop a devotional relationship, a one-to-one personal devotional relationship to Vishnu. This is bhakti, and you do it through doing puja rituals in honor of Vishnu, or Narayana, or Vasudeva, whether at home or in a temple. In return, devotees would get the Lord's grace, or prasada, which helps you with your worldly problems and helps you to eliminate karmic bondage and to potentially escape rebirth. So it's a simple and straightforward transaction. We know about the early Bhagavata tradition from inscriptions that were made by different rulers and aristocrats who called themselves Bhagavatas, or Mahabhagavatas, great Bhagavatas, or even Parama Bhagavatas, the highest Bhagavatas. And this is based on the kind of levels of donations that they made to temples where they would be recorded, inscribed in stone. So you can see why this mainstream Bhagavata tradition became so popular in society. It was a way for kings to kind of get prestige, much like what the horse sacrifice maybe had done for Vedic kings, but it was much easier to do so this way, right? Another distinct tradition of Vishnu worship is also worth mentioning, and that's the more esoteric yogic tradition of what's called the Pancharatras school. This is a renunciant tradition in contrast to the ritualist Bhagavata tradition. And it required an initiation to be admitted into the orders, a diksha. And it's like the Shaiva renunciants we looked at last time, right? The Pancharatras, would then use yogic and tantric practices to achieve liberation, union with Vishnu. Unlike the more transgressive Shaiva sects, though, the Pancharatras schools were strict adherents to the principles of ahimsa, non-harm, so they didn't eat meat, they didn't drink liquor, or engage in any impure acts. Instead, the idea was to follow the path of bhakti, along with more austere yoga practices, meditation, tantric practices, to merge oneself with that highest Vishnu and gain liberation. Okay, so now to turn to how ordinary people worshipped Vishnu back then. This is actually still how people worship Vishnu today, and it's again similar to what we saw with Shiva. There's both iconic forms and aniconic forms of Vishnu. The aniconic form of Vishnu is called a shaligram. And it's usually this naturally occurring black ammonoid fossil that it's a shell stone, basically, that's quite commonly found in riverbanks all across the subcontinent, like the one you see on here. If you find one, it's supposed to kind of symbolize Vishnu's pervasive presence in the world. There's also the iconic worship of Vishnu, which is more frequently found maybe on posters and temple sculptures all over the place, really. Like with Shiva, the key to understanding iconography, iconic imagery of Vishnu, is that each of the features of the artwork is linked to one or another of the key myths about Vishnu. They kind of hearken those myths, and the presence of these features and myths make the god real and recognizable in the eyes of the devotee. The god or a goddess is usually well hidden in the world. Then, if we can't just call them up and have like an ordinary conversation like we might with our friends or family, how are we able to access them? How do we know that he or she is real? Well, we have to both experience that reality, also to cognize it, to make sense of it mentally. Seeing a physical image does both, right? It gives you a direct, visual, tangible experience of God, and also a way to understand, to cognize him or her. So what are the different features of Vishnu that we can see in this iconography? First, he has 4 arms. This is something you have to kind of get used to with classical and modern Hindu gods and goddesses. Many heads, many arms. It's an indicator maybe of their superhuman abilities, their manifold nature. The complexity of being a god, maybe all the objects that you see over there are also connected to one or another of the Vishnu myths. There's the Kaustubha, which is a jewel that he has on his chest. The Syamantaka, which is a jewel on his wrist. There's also this curious whorl of hair on his chest, which is called the Shrivatsa. All of these are connected to different Vishnu myths. Then you'll notice that there's a lotus coming out of his navel, with a tiny little 4-headed Lord Brahma, the grandfather, who's just being born. That's supposed to mean that even though Brahma is the grandfather, he creates the cosmos and sort of rules over it, it's ultimately Vishnu who created Brahma. Right? Vishnu's weapons also have their own roles in his mythology. He carries a mace or a sword or a bow, but his signature weapon is this discus that you see in his upper right hand. This weapon is called the Sudarshana, and it's sometimes also seen to have his own personality. It can appear in human form as well. As a disc, it symbolizes dharma, which we'd seen as a wheel before, if you remember. But it's more punitive or violent kind of dharma, maybe. In his other hands, you see Vishnu holding a conch shell, sometimes a lotus. The conch is supposed to symbolize life, and also act as a kind of bugle that's blown during a puja to Vishnu. It's also blown during war. The lotus also symbolizes life and rebirth, since lotuses are born out of mud. Now, Vishnu's wife, as we noticed before, is Lakshmi, also known as Shri, the goddess of wealth or fortune, who's worshipped quite often on her own, in addition to with Vishnu. In front of Vishnu, you see his animal vehicle, his loyal servant named Garuda, the eagle. Vishnu also has another animal associated with him, and that's behind him, the great 7-headed cosmic snake named Shesha, on whose belly he usually lies, fast asleep on that ocean of milk, wherever that may be. Right? It's only when Vishnu's awakened for some specific purpose, like a crisis that's happening, he needs to restore the balance of law or dharma in this world, that he stirs and enters into the world in the form of an incarnation or an avatara. And again, that's what's going to be depicted in these scenes as Shiva and other gods come to ask for Vishnu's help. The divine bard Narada sometimes is there, explaining what's going on in the world, kind of as a reporter, right, a news reporter, why we need his help and he needs to enter the world. So we'll take a break here. In our next segment, we'll find out a bit more about how and why Vishnu comes down to earth to help to intervene and restore dharma in this world. So,